Hello again, good evening, and welcome back to another episode of Minds on Guard, where we're learning how to guard our minds against all of the manipulations, attacks, and confusion that we're confronted with every day here in the 21st century. In our last video, we began discussing a critical thinking error that has become really ubiquitous in today's media landscape. The appeal to authority fallacy is a massive driver for some of the most intense and pervasive problems in the 21st century society. If we are truly going to live with our minds on guard, we need to learn about this thinking error and all of the ways that it can and does lead to problems in our world today, really in our day-to-day lives as individuals. We began speaking about how this fallacy occurs at a mass societal level, but really what I want to focus on is how and why any one of us might fall into this thinking error. The reason for this is because we all have an individual responsibility for how we go about our day-to-day lives, how we treat one another, how we view ourselves in relation to reality. It's really not enough to simply observe problems as we've been doing here in the world, and then go about committing the same errors which exacerbate those same problems in our own lives. That would defeat the purpose of the whole channel. The tools we're gaining here are meant to be used for good, and to help improve our situations, not to simply know what to call things that we see in either ourselves or others, or online whenever we're just sort of digging into the news or scrolling social media. If you've made it this far into this series of videos, my sincere hope is that you would take up the challenge of self-examination and implement changes to your thinking in order to take control of your own life. There is little that could be more important given the state of things today. With more and more censorship and the coming adoption of ubiquitous AI, the risks of appealing to bias or dishonest authorities when it comes to the information that we take in is really becoming unmanageable. Before too long, it will be nearly impossible to distinguish truth from lies. We must prepare ourselves and develop our mental and emotional strength so that we can resist the easy path of relinquishing control of our thoughts and our behavior. As I said before, this will need to start in each individual. In order to make sure that we are honest in that effort, we need to take some time to answer some questions. What kinds of manipulations of the truth am I allowing into my thought processes? Am I generating or furthering any of the same kinds of manipulations through my own thoughts and behaviors? If so, why am I doing any of this? And finally, what ends is all of this serving? In other words, how am I benefiting from those things? What drives us when we fall into appeals to authority? Remember that it can be summed up as expert A says B is true, therefore B is true. Like other thinking errors, one of the main cognitive missteps at work is an underlying reliance on an emotional response to the world around us. We have seen many errors in thinking that seem to dovetail and overlap, and this fallacy is no different. At some level, our biases are informed by our feelings of one form or another. Depending on how these feelings align with the truth of reality, reliance on an expert to help us understand something that is causing us issues may yield a great deal of positive outcomes. However, the opposite occurs when we are at odds with the truth and have given our critical thinking skills over to any number of cognitive dissonances and delusions that are bred from emotional reactions to things that trigger the deep-level psychological defense mechanisms that we all have. In order to answer the first question of what kinds of manipulations of the truth am I allowing into my thought processes, we need to become aware of our sort of go-to emotional responses and why those are present in our lives. So we can ask more questions. What are people afraid of? What causes us anxiety? What sorts of things can we simply not tolerate and will stop at nothing to make sure is kept out of our lives, even if it means that we wind up harming another person just to feel secure or in control over our emotional state? The answer to these questions will obviously vary from person to person. Some people fear failure, while others fear success. Sometimes an anxiety attack can be triggered when we have to confront an issue in a painful relationship. We might get angry if we feel pressured into doing or saying something that we don't want to say or do. Other times, it can simply be that we heard something that made us uncomfortable or calls our past choices into question. Whatever the case may be, our emotional reactions tend to be linked to how and why we think the way we do. This, of course, is not necessarily the case all of the time, and our effort here is to minimize the chances of this happening. Yet, whenever we are appealing to emotion, we can almost be certain that some appeal to authority is happening as well, whether that be an outside authority or an internal one. So, what kinds of manipulations of the truth are we allowing into our thought processes? Well, when we are off of our guard, it's likely that we can find any and all that might calm our emotional response and provide the kind of dopamine spike which comes from feeling good and in control of ourselves. We have the ability to generate that spike in many ways, and if we're not careful, it will be to the harm of ourselves and those around us. Now that is a kind of delusion that we want to avoid at all costs. One of the main emotional drivers for these kinds of appeal fallacies is fear. We've spoken of the dangers of being controlled by fear on this channel before, and once again, we need to dig into some of the more subtle ways in which people's fears can wreak havoc on our thinking and our decision-making. Selfishness and defenses born out of our ego rest at the core of many of the more manipulative fears that we all have. Just consider the state of things in the world today around health narratives and political ideologies, and all of the various activist agendas that prop up the 24-hour news cycles. The entertainment news media model gains its life through the manipulation of people's fears. I think it's helpful to think about the news media as a conscious entity, especially when we're trying to get a grip on how we're controlled by the kinds of information that we're exposed to every day. Through the use of clever imagery, subtle or overt symbolism, subtle, iterative language, and statistical trickery, the environment created by the news media is a behemoth bent on control through fear. To give credit where credit is due, the crafters of the media narratives know their psychology well. When people are fearful and ignorant of how to parse truth, the quickest way to regain that sense of control over reality is to resort what's worked in the past. These are often known as heuristics in our thinking processes. Even if we have no evidence that something is true, the fact that some form of data has been said over and over again by some expert or a perceived expert in some form or fashion can give off the appearance of fact while being a complete falsehood. In the court of popular opinion, the loudest voice tends to rule the day. Every social media platform is designed to reinforce the various echo chambers that are created through some level of appeal to authority. Through the harvesting of behavioral and biometric data, algorithms pump more and more of the same kinds of information and emotional manipulation into every user's feed, making it so that each person gets a curated and personally tailored narrative by which they're able to prop up their own conception of the truth of things. The problem arises when we start to question these narratives and the information that is being sold as true. If we're dealing with an honest person or entity, dialogue can and often does lead to discovery and learning. However, if we're engaged with someone or something that is either stuck in the pattern of fear and emotional reactivity, or is benefiting in some way from this remaining in the environment, we can expect to be attacked to any arbitrary degree that is necessary for that person to feel secure in their control over how they are seen or understood. This can play out in ruined friendships, shunning from certain groups over extreme disagreements, ostracization as punishment for some perceived offense, and even physical attacks. All of these are the very things that we want to avoid. Appeals to authority cause so many problems. Relying on any sort of expert to do our thinking for us should be avoided until and unless we have done the critical work of vetting what is being used by said expert. Where this fallacy becomes deeply problematic is when we subconsciously make ourselves the ultimate authority on any given area of understanding. We've spoken about this in previous videos. This is where we can begin to answer the question of how and why we allow the manipulations into our own thoughts. And more importantly, how does doing so lead to our own benefit? We've already begun to address the how and the why by latching on to the narratives that have been created by any number of echo chambers or manipulated data. We gain a sense of control over our understanding of reality, and we've been able to do so with really very little effort. That control feeds our dopamine response, and we gain a sense of contentment. Back this up with the kinds of educational programming that we've discussed before, and you have a real big problem on your hands. What needs to be examined further in each individual is just why would we want to have that feeling in the first place? This is where we can begin to approach the answer to, how is this benefiting me? We must first identify core fears in our subconscious. Many people fear the unknown, of possibly looking stupid in front of others, of losing face in a group of friends. Some people have crafted whole personas around a facade of feigned expertise in order to buffer themselves from the pain of all of these fears. Some people will go so far as to avoid the pain of facing the truth of their own selfishness and arrogance, that they will subconsciously alter reality to make it that in their minds, everyone who does not agree with them on a given issue is actually motivated by evil and must be treated as such. At the depths of these fears is often a misplaced sense of personal value. People are broken, and often in that brokenness we attach our deepest, most intrinsic sense of who we are and our self-worth to things that ultimately are fleeting and incapable of truly providing the source of our value as humans. I've spoken about how people misuse the term identity to speak about some kind of attribute that describes a part of them in relation to the world. This has been seized upon by the greater manipulative forces in the world, and what we see now is people destroying themselves and others for the sake of some misplaced value and sense of who they really are. In much the same way, we may attach our value to the ways in which we are perceived by others, or even ourselves. When we do this, it's not hard to see how we could delude ourselves into thinking that we need to protect that sense of who we are. This leads to us propping ourselves up as a kind of authority, in that we must maintain our sense of self-worth, and if that is put in danger, we may react in some severe ways. This may look like simply lying about something we saw or heard, altering our position on some issue to seem like we agree with people, accusing others of manipulating you or gaslighting, or even going so far as to smear or attack someone's reputation online or in a community. There are very few lengths that people won't go if they have made themselves the ultimate authority on what is true about themselves. I want to stress that this is driven by fear of losing something. When you see people committing this thinking error, you can bet with a pretty solid certainty that they're afraid of something. It's not my aim here to call people out and to expose them, but more to say that we do not have to live with this fear driving us in these ways. Our value is not found in the things that we know, or how we sound to others, or how we write or create or even look. Those things are what make up our personality, but our value, our true value, is found in our status as imagers of God and what that means. We are loved so far beyond the attributes of the material world. If we can let that be true, we can begin to break free from the chains of fear that the world tries to trap us with, and begin to think much more clearly, because we will have peace which comes from the only real source of truth in the universe. That foundation can and does lead to real knowledge and deep understanding, which we can use to reflect God's love back into His creation and help others gain that same peace. Let's keep growing here and lift up one another to not tear down and lord over others to make ourselves feel better. Until next time, I hope you stay safe. I hope you stay diligent, always keeping your minds on guard.